first got interested in historic preservation in the early 50s when there was a good bit of publicity about the work that was being done in Charleston, and the whole concept of it not being just renovating and preserving landmark buildings, but buildings that were just in use by everyday kinds of people, stores and things like that.
Second Avenue was especially threatened because the buildings, the businesses that were in there were just taking over the ground level, and the upper levels were kind of vacant and falling apart. You know, it was, you could see that no one was investing in those buildings.
Here, before I opened, there was no interstate. The trucks came through this street with the truck drivers. So what you had on this street were drug addicts, prostitutes, truck drivers. It was dreadful.
Gradually, you know, people just started, you know, thinking, well, okay, maybe we could even live down here. And there was people like Mr. Bass, the architect, who owned property there as an office and maintained it and kind of led the way, saying, look, this can be a really attractive storefront.
Richard Fulton, who was the mayor at the time, was very interested in Second Avenue becoming something other than what it was, which was pretty awful.
My husband, Robinson Neal Bass, was an architect. Neal was involved in the early formation of historic Nashville. It was a very energetic group, and they really shared the vision of what could be done.
Goodies Warehouse, and it was a fantastic building. It had all the Italianate moldings intact, the cornices were all there, nothing had been peeled off and modernized, and there was this woman named Barbara Kurland that we just were like, you want to do what?
I am Barbara Kurland, and in 1976 I was in China, and when I came home I realized I didn't know much about the United States, but I knew a lot about China. And so I started to look around in the city, and I realized this was maybe one of the longest commercial real estate streets still existing. And I thought, what beautiful buildings, why don't I do something in one of them? And that was, by 1977, I was in and running. Well, it wasn't a store, I was opening a building, and my first tenant was a stained glass worker who took half of the third floor. And then the man who did the Fridays chain collected all of his antiques in the basement of the building. And so then it was just a question of putting retail in between on the main floor. Building was where that hole in the ground is. And then right after I moved out, there was arson and the building was burned. On this side of the street were the famous lawyers. George Barrett, who was a labor attorney, among other things, civil rights attorney. Avon Williams, a very famous civil rights lawyer, where Judge Dinkins got his start as a young lawyer. And it was, because it was so close to City Hall, it was all lawyers. But it has always been a commercial street, and so it'll survive, and in another 100 years it'll be something else, I hope.
Nashville was founded on an area that was ancient. First human beings that can be proven to be here were more than 14,000 years ago, and it was a continually occupied for many, many millennia. The settlers arrived in 1779 and 1780 and established 8 different settlements along the Cumberland River, one of which was where downtown Nashville is. Some people have called it the French Lick, some people called it the Bluff Station. Depends on where you were. At a distance back then, it wasn't one place, it was several places that got incorporated into one place later. James Robertson made 2 trips. He led 2 groups here. And in March of 1779, he arrived with about 12 individuals, and they were scouting out the area. And they encountered a number of other people. And what was going on was that the Revolutionary War was going on in the East, but that was going to open up. England was not able to restrict settlement beyond the mountains anymore like they had for the last 15 years. So suddenly everybody's going, the only way we're ever going to have a chance to get wealthy and get land is right now. We've got to go and claim our land and see what happens later. They came thinking that it would be okay if they settled this area. The area was not a Native American homeland at that point, although there were no houses and villages of Native Americans along the Cumberland River at that point. It's staggering to think about what they did go through. They basically went 200 miles beyond any previous white settlements. Most central figure to early Nashville was James Robertson. He was wounded 3 different times. One time he almost died, 2 other times he was just badly wounded. He had 2 children killed. One was a 12-year-old son who got beheaded and his head put on a stick outside of the fort where Robertson was. 2 brothers. He had every vexation connected with leadership you can imagine over a period of 15 years that he had to endure. He was the one who, when other people decided it was impossible to stay here because they couldn't hunt, they couldn't raise food, he said, I'm not going anywhere. And he kept enough of his fellow settlers here to barely hold on. A surveyor named Thomas Malloy laid out Nashville in 200 one-acre lots. 2nd Avenue, Market Street, was one of the streets he laid out. The business center of Nashville was 2nd Avenue from the time it was founded until the 1820s at least, because of its proximity to the river. Of course, water was the highway. That was like the combination of the railroad tracks, the interstate highways, the airways. That was all there really was.
Good morning, I'm Mark Zimmerman, a local author and historian, and this morning we're sitting on the east bank of the Cumberland River, directly across from downtown Nashville, as you can see, the riverfront here. And this was exactly where the steamboat landing for Nashville was, or the wharf, during the early part of the 1800s. It was not unusual to see 1 or 2 dozen steamboats at a time tied up here, unloading or loading their cargo. By 1830, the steamboat had become big business on the Cumberland River. The steamboat revolutionized transportation and the hauling of cargo and merchandise. Most of the river traffic was done on flatboats, which were not powered or only powered by manpower, sometimes hauled by horses or mules on the banks. By 1854, there were 22 packets, which is a definite steamboat route between Nashville and another city, 22 packets running from Nashville. 5 years later, there were 72 packets running from Nashville. And by the time of the Civil War, around 1860, there was over 1 million tons of cargo being loaded and unloaded here in Nashville every year. And here you can see a couple of barges with a tugboat being pushed upstream. So you can see today the Cumberland is still used to haul cargo and freight. The Civil War changed things drastically. The Federal Army came in and occupied the city and turned it into a vast transportation hub and logistics center, basically a supply depot. Now, after the Civil War, Captain Thomas Ryman was one of the major steamboat operators on the Cumberland. He's vastly wealthy. He had a huge house over on College Hill overlooking the river. One Sunday he decided to go and see the evangelist Sam Jones, who was having a tent revival in town. Well, he was so taken with Reverend Jones that he immediately converted to Christianity, and he stopped selling alcohol on his boats. He and Reverend Jones got together and they built the Union Gospel Tabernacle. Huge auditorium, almost shaped kind of like a barn. And Thomas Ryman spared no expense in building this building.
By acts of the Assembly of North Carolina in 1784, a town was established at the bluffs and called Nashville. The first survey of lots in the town was made by Thomas Malloy. 4 one-acre lots were set aside for the public square that included a marketplace building, courthouse, and jail. The principal business of Nashville was conducted on Market Street and the public square, putting them at the very heart of Nashville and fueling its future growth. Nashville was incorporated in 1806. The population was about 1,100. The exact figure is unknown because the British burned the census records during the War of 1812. None but professional men and merchants lived in the town. Most of the population at that day lived on farms in the country. Lardner Clark, merchant and ordinary keeper, was the first man to open a dry goods store in Nashville, which he did in the early 1780s on Market Street. The first goods were packed on 10 horses and brought overland from Philadelphia. John Gordon, brave captain of the spies under Andrew Jackson in the Creek War, kept a hotel on the west side of Market Street. In 1796, the Methodists acquired a building on the public square near the jail and stocks and began preaching. This building was later pulled down and the preaching was held in the jail for several years. General Jackson, the first steamboat to reach Nashville from New Orleans, arrived March 11, 1819. Hundreds came from near and far to behold this wonder of the waters. In 1823, the population was 3,460, and in 1830, 5,566, of whom 1,108 were slaves and 204 free Negroes. In 1825, over $1 million worth of cotton was shipped to market from Nashville. Andrew Jackson was elected the first president from the West in 1828. The first suspension bridge, designed by Nashville architect Adolphus Hyman, was completed on September 19, 1850. 12 years later, the retreating Confederate Army, after the fall of Fort Donelson, cut the cables and the bridge collapsed. The bridge was rebuilt in 1866. In May 1843, the steamboat Nashville made a trip to Nashville from New Orleans in just 6 days and 13 hours. And on the 5th of June, Nashville broke its own record by making the trip in 5 days and 19 hours. Year 1845 should be remembered. James K. Polk was inaugurated 11th president on March 4th, and Andrew Jackson died at the Hermitage on June 8th, and the cornerstone for the state capitol was laid on July 4th. Architect William Strickland designed the state capitol. Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale, gave 2 evening concerts at the Adelphi Theater in Nashville on March 31 and April 1st, 1851. P.T. Barnum served as her manager. At the first concert, the local newspaper reported that her renditions of Birdsong and Echo Song were captivating. Such a musical event had never been experienced in Nashville. Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad was chartered by the state in 1845. On December 13, 1850, the steamboat Beauty from Cincinnati arrived at the Nashville Wharf with the first locomotive, plus 13 freight cars and a passenger car. Mule power hauled the locomotive from the wharf to South Cherry Street. From that location on December 27, 1850, a 1-mile run was made to Antioch, Tennessee. Reverend Leroy Halsey speaks of Nashville in 1859. We had occasion to visit it for the first time in 1830 and recollect distinctly what it was then, as from an adjoining hill, and on an autumn morning we saw its rocks and cedar housetops partially covered with the first fall of snow and glittering like a mount of diamonds in the rising sun. It was a compact little city of some 5,000 or 6,000 souls, confined pretty much to a single hill or bluff on the left bank of the Cumberland. But it was beautiful even then, set like a gem in the green casket of the surrounding hill country. Now in 1859, it has 16 Protestant churches, 3 lines of railroad, 100 steamboats, and an annual trade, including its manufactures, of 25 million. There's a spacious square for the courthouse and market, lined now with stores so solid and elegant that they would not look out of place in the business streets of New York, whose stores are palaces. In 1856, a fire started at the Nashville Inn that spread to the courthouse and other buildings on the public square, causing great destruction. In 1862, Nashville surrenders to the Union Army, causing a great panic. In 1866, the first horse-drawn streetcar was operated in Nashville. In 1892, faster electric cars replaced the horse cars. The Maxwell House Hotel was opened for guests on September 2, 1869. Because of its stature, 7 U.S. presidents and other prominent guests stayed there over the years. It was built by Colonel John Overton and named for his wife, Harriet Maxwell Overton. Tragically, the Maxwell House Hotel burned Christmas Day, 1961. Fires were a constant threat in Nashville during the 19th century. The city had volunteer firemen. In 1860, there were 600 volunteers in the fire department. On the 26th of May, 1877, the Jewish temple on South Vine Street was dedicated. Nashville was a busy, compact metropolis of nearly 60,000 inhabitants, including the late annexations. In 1880, an exposition building was opened to celebrate 100 years of progress since the founding. In 1897, Tennessee held a 6-month celebration to mark the 100th anniversary of statehood. The Tennessee Centennial Exposition was held in Nashville from May 1st until October 30th, 1897, although the state's actual centennial occurred in 1896. There have been many changes to the public square and Market Street since the big fire that claimed the Burns Block. Entire blocks were removed and every building on the public square torn down and replaced. Nashville Courthouse, designed in 1857 by Francis Strickland, son of state capitol architect William Strickland, was raised in 1936. The current courthouse, in the Art Deco style, was completed in 1937. Today, the City Market, 1934, now called the Ben West Municipal Building, and the courthouse are the oldest buildings on the public square.
We had some volunteers that gathered up some photographs of the front of the Silver Dollar Saloon. Miss Amos had somehow had these photographs, and of these men, with cigars, posing in front of the building, and the cloth awnings, were there, and all the advertisements for the beers and sandwiches. And you could kind of barely see inside where the tile work, that they, back then the Victorians used a lot of mosaic tiles on the floor, and it was what was there when we were there with the Historic Nashville office. But what the Historic Nashville found when we moved in was that there were little pockmarked empty spots throughout the tile where the silver dollars used to be. And so it was like, oh, so that floor, the building was intact, the floor was intact, the saloon was gone. People came and presented silver dollars that they had, and they wanted to donate to put back in the little pockmarked spots on the floor.
Beginning at Broadway, we head north up 2nd Avenue to explore each building on the historic east side. Wonderfully Victorian, the large pedimented cornice introduces itself. Watkins Block, 1875. Samuel Watkins, the brickmaker and builder, gave this group his name. Coming to Nashville in 1827, Watkins was quite a successful businessman. He made his fortunes not once, but twice. The first was made before the beginning of the war in 1861. the second after having lost everything to the Union Army, who seized and occupied the city properties. In 1862, he joined the gas company when its superintendent was taken prisoner. At the age of 85, 4 years after the erection of Watkins Block, he began making plans for the establishment of Watkins Institute, educating adult Nashvillians today. Watkins died in 1888 at 94 years of age. Rounder upper floor windows alternating with tall pilasters give this facade the appearance of a two-story arcade. Ornamentation is reduced to simple brickwork above and between the arched and rectangular window combination. The property was purchased by Daniel F. Carter in 1869, handed down within his family and sold finally by his daughter Rachel Craighead in 1923. The actual building was probably constructed not long before the 1888 to 1902 occupation of C.A. Litterer and Company, dealers in farm implements. Max Shatton and Son were prominent shoe wholesalers on 2nd Avenue. This glass-filled facade is a product of the modern 20th century. Her interior and 1st Avenue facade, however, are of an earlier design that recalls the 1889 to 1937 ownership of Daniel F. Carter's family. American Paper and Twine Company was a major tenant and is still in business today at another location. Wild Horse Saloon now occupies the building. The relatively small structure with her massive cornice and heavy-set brackets has been literally sandwiched by the two most modern buildings of the district. As a result, her Victorian features have been isolated for easy recognition and appreciation. Only 3 windows in width, her 3-story facade has a central bay advancing upward into a parapet dated 1879. Unlike the others, her Market Street facade is repeated on 1st Avenue. T.M. DeMoss & Son occupied this building since 1938 and remained until the street changed to retail outlets. The Hooper Building, so obviously modern, with Victorian examples to each side, is composed of straight, clean lines and filled with glass. Dated by an inset stone panel reading 1924, this contrasting yet undisturbing style was constructed by John M. Hooper. A sign for the Hooper Grocery is still seen on the 1st Avenue facade. The old Dudley Building has brickwork gracefully highlighting the recessed windows of her 2 upper stories and adds to the fine details of this late 19th century structure. When Lipscomb left in 1890 to form his own business a few doors up the street, the firm then became the Dudley Brothers, whose sign is still faintly visible across the front of the building. Still later, Gray and Dudley Hardware would evolve and construct the building starting at 225 2nd Avenue. Built around the turn of the century, this facade displays features characteristic of both the 19th century Victorian and the 20th century modern. Large square glass areas are recessed within 3 unbroken pilasters, giving a strong sense of verticality to the building. Clinging to the past is the overhanging corners, even though proportionally smaller than that of the earlier design. Built after 1890, Charles Nelson bought the property in 1888 and operated his liquor distributor at this location until 1909, no doubt discontinued due to prohibition. The Lipscomb Building, also transitional in design, exhibits turn-of-the-century decline in Victorian elaboration. Its bilateral window treatment with central pilaster does not differ greatly from that of her adjoining neighbor. H.G. Lipscomb & Company was organized as a wholesale hardware business in this building in 1892. The company mainly dealt in rural trade. Many of the items listed in 1913 catalogs, such as harnesses, chamber pots, crop cutters, and lamps, are still being sold today. Opened in this location in 1892, the company had the longest history of any firm on 2nd Avenue in one location, and operated here until the street changed to retail, office, and residential space. Identified by the inset stone inscribed Pilcher, this modern warehouse is only a modified cornice left as a reminder of more Victorian days. Built in 1902 by Andrew Pilcher for his offices and grain business, she was also owned by M.E. Derryberry's family after his 1912 purchase of the property until 1943. Variously patterned moldings between and underneath paired brackets give this large block the most elaborate cornice in the district. 3 stories tall and 12 windows wide, Her facade is uncluttered in spite of its complexity. Such dynamic Victorian Italianate elements date this edifice to the mid-1870s. Lending notoriety to this particular spot on 2nd Avenue is the 1901 to 1907 presence of Cheek Neal Coffee Company and Lee C. Joel Owsley Cheek, the originator of the Maxwell House coffee blend. Another company with a long history at this location is Nashville Sash and Door, owned and operated by the McAllister family. This long row of 5 identical 3-story buildings carries the title Springbrook Building. One of the earlier structures in the district, her facade is much less ostentatious than those of the full-blown Victorian style. Smaller proportion moldings and a subdued roofline produce a simple, quiet effect. John T. Foote bought this property in 1868. In 1870, 2 known occupants were McRae & Company, listed as cotton and tobacco factors, and Orr Brothers Wholesale Grocers. A later tenant, the Old Spaghetti Factory, was a fixture of downtown Nashville for 40 years, but would not reopen its 2nd Avenue location following the Christmas Day bombing. What an imagination the creator of the Ray Building must have had. A 2-level facade edged in layered brick and string coursed by terracotta friezes contains a combination of arched and rectangular windows. The 2nd-story arcade is repeated in the patterned brickwork near the roofline. The central semicircle bears the date 1887 and the name given the building by her owner, Bird S. Ray & Son, Seed and Feed Business. Smooth surface cornices upheld by grooved and capitalized pilasters characterize the 3-story facade of number 170. Built after 1883, when the property was dated to William A. Goodwin, and before 1890, when Brown and Farrell Hardware was located here, this building was also owned by M.E. Derryberry family from the years 1914 to 1970. Since the 1970 purchase by the architect Neil Bass, the front part of the warehouse interior has been redesigned for modern office purposes. This building was devastated from the Christmas bombing. This 3-story building is distinguished by a central bay with corbel brick projecting above the recessed bay to each side. Heavy molding adorn the few windows which break the surface of the brick facade. The lot owned by the builder John S. Hart from 1866 to 1889, this building appears to have been erected in the 1880s before the 1889 transfer of the property to Charles Nelson. In 1890, C.B. Pearson Company, dealers in liquors and wine, were lessees of the warehouse. This building was also devastated from the Christmas bombing. Although displaying 2 unlike facades, number 174 and 176 are actually one structure divided by a common wall. The first contains rectangular windows with heavy, unusual shaped moldings. Her brick is painted red. The latter has arch windows and molding and is painted white. Coordinating the 2 are continuous and identical cornices surmounting these 4 stories. Number 176 was owned by Orr Brothers from 1876 to 1880 and Robert Orr and family from 1881 to 1951. These buildings were also devastated from the Christmas bombing. Once again, a straight modern face emerges from the row of fairly ornamented fronts. Judging from appearance, numbers 178 and 180 were constructed in the late 1920s or 30s. This narrow building is small and without great elaboration. However, her facade, upheld by slender cast iron columns, is highlighted by a uniquely patterned cornice. According to deed information, construction took place within the years 1882 and 1898. The Nashville Paper Stock Company, whose name bans the front, bought the property in 1922. Ending the continuous frontage between Broad Street and Church Street is number 184. The horizontal lines of this broad corner building cross an arrangement of windows recessed between narrow piers and punctuated by brick relief. Limited surface decoration is indicative of her late 19th century style. In 1898, the property was purchased by J.O. Kirkpatrick. 3 years later, occupiers of 184 were C.T. Cheek & Son. The son and partner of the wholesale grocery firm was Leslie Cheek, whose mansion is now the Tennessee Fine Arts Center at Cheekwood. Actually, 2 buildings of similar design, number 200 to 202 were built sometime between the years 1881 and 1890. In 1881, Corbett Brothers dealt in horse furnishings here. Later, Goody's incorporated various shops and studios in the 19th century warehouse setting. These buildings were burned in 1985. A photograph of the Washington Manufacturing Company building at 200 and 210 shows it after it was gutted by fire on October 12, 1985. At the time of the fire, it was one of the oldest buildings on 2nd Avenue in downtown Nashville, dating to at least the Civil War. An 1864 photograph of the building identifies it as a hospital. It also housed the Manhattan Carriage Company in the late 1800s. It was part of the multi-building complex of the Washington Manufacturing Company during much of the 20th century. This section of 2nd Avenue was listed on the National Register of Historic Sites in 1972. Eventually, the entire side of the block from Church Street north to Bank Street was razed. One of the more imposing structures on the block is a 4-story facade which includes a projecting central bay topped by a pedimental form. Monumentally scaled molding creates a busy surface. High-relief eyebrows accent the closely grouped windows. Thick string courses delineate each story. Liberally applied brackets support the uppermost cornice and also the string courses at points within the bay and around the building corner. A plaque has been erected designating this site as the approximate location of Nashville's first store. Her flamboyant Victorian style in conjunction with deed information suggests that the existing building was erected in the 1870s for early occupation by Tyler, Stratton and Company. By 1881, the Moore-Stratton families owned this entire block. In 1939, Washington Manufacturing became the owner of the block. They made DC jeans and casual clothing. The building now houses various businesses. The earliest photograph was taken during the Civil War circa 1864 and has the old Watson House Hotel as its main subject. Rich in arches and fanciful terracotta details, her surface extends upward into a somewhat Baroque pedimental form. A tall mansard roof is in the background, claiming to have been designed by Zwicker, the architect of the Silver Dollar Saloon. This corner structure is an example of the late Victorian architecture that did not follow the trend towards severe simplification. The Brandon Printing Company was a major investor in this end of Market Street, preceding the present Washington Manufacturing Company. As of 1963, Washington Manufacturing Company would own the entire block, just as Morrison Stratton had done almost 100 years earlier. Historic 2nd Avenue will continue to adapt and change as Nashville continues to grow.